But my name is Jeffrey Moss. I am really excited to moderate this panel talking about brand. And we all know brand can be incredibly valuable. It's why we drink Pepsi instead of Coke. It's why we use Microsoft instead of Macs. But we also know that the brands have a flip side. And the flip side is stereotypes. Brands lead people to make assumptions about people based upon their school, their major, their background, their race, and about companies. The ones we want to work on, the ones that we want to work for, whether we want to work in tech or CPG, et cetera. So with that, I'm really excited for today's panel where we're going to discuss brands across the entire career life cycle, from training and hiring students to ensuring a diverse and inclusive workplace. So the first question, and Lori, I'll start with you. There's a lot of discussion around if college students are job ready. Are they?
I think it's a question of what job ready means. What is the expectation? And I think when you read what employers are talking about in terms of the skills that are lacking in students, they talk about things like communication skills, teamwork, problem solving, creative thinking, but I'm not sure it's what they're searching for. So when I look at our liberal arts students who walk away with all of those kinds of skills, I see history majors and philosophy majors and sociology majors who are frustrated in job search because they can't get to the first interview because they're weeded out based on their major. And I think there's a disconnect in terms of both the students being able to articulate those skills better, but also the hiring managers, the applicant tracking systems, finding a way to not weed students out who might answer exactly those questions for the employers.
No, it's interesting because, again, we talk, everything you're mentioning are skills that are highlighted by NACE and the survey about the skills most in demand by companies. Ed, I mean, what are you seeing at Microsoft around that? What are you seeing from an innovative perspective to get Microsoft's hiring managers to look beyond the pedigree?
I think it's I think it's interesting. It's not necessarily the hiring managers, in my opinion. I think the hiring managers, in a lot of regards, get it in terms of it's a complete body of work when you're looking at someone's experience. I think you've got algorithms now determining which resumes get presented to recruiters, and recruiters spend on average anywhere from 30 to 45 seconds on a resume on an average basis. So I think further upstream, I think people understand like it is the complete body of work, but we need to influence those that are on the front lines in order to be able to keep pushing people through the system.
Michelle, you look like you want to say something.
I do, thank you. So I saw some interesting research from the Public Religion Research Institute, and it talks about how 40 to 60% of us interact with someone once a week that's diverse, and 80% of us interact with people that are diverse at our workplaces. And so one of the things that I think we can do a better job of is really helping students to understand that when they get into the workplace, this may be the first time, if they identify as an underrepresented person, that someone has interacted with someone like them. And so part of the job, I think, for universities is to help students really understand who they are, what their strengths are, where they are really good, because when you are courageous and confident in what your strength is, then you're going to show up better for the workplace. And so that's one of the things, is helping people to really understand what they are good at and live into that strength. And then the other thing is we prepare students to think about their major, and we say that's a really important thing. But the other thing that's important is really understanding how to communicate effectively. So talking about what you're working on, how the thing that you're working on is connected to the team's broader vision, and how to market yourself and be an effective employee. And that's something that we're not really teaching students how to do, is be great employees and think critically about their work on a day-to-day basis.
But that's a great segue. Again, Lori alluded to it before, but Brian runs a great program at the United Negro College Fund called Career Pathways Initiative, which is very much aligned to that. What are you doing from that perspective around helping the students take responsibility and ownership for their career path so they can communicate those core skills?
Sure, thank you, Jeff. Well, the Career Pathways Initiative is a $50 million grant-funded project by the Lilly Endowment that is working with HBCUs and PBIs, predominantly black institutions. How many people, do we have any HBCU alums in the audience? One?
One.
Okay, all right, well, good. Glad to see you representing back there. And so the CPI program, initially, the campuses thought this was an opportunity for them to cover their career services operations for 5 years. And we wanted them to think more broadly than that. How do they construct the student experience during their 4, 5, or 6 year period to help them be best prepared for careers? How do you deconstruct the curriculum in a way that aligns more effectively with the workforce expectations and industry expectations that they're going into? And also, how can you do certain things like help those students in the humanities or the liberal arts fields get certain kinds of skills that make them more marketable and gets them past the first interview, because we want to help the students be as dynamically prepared as possible. So we're helping to prepare them on those soft skills, like you mentioned, Lori, how to communicate their experiences, their effectiveness, and their abilities in ways that speak to 21st century employers like Microsoft. And also, I think there's work that needs to be done on both sides, and we're trying to do that as well. We're working with not only the campuses, but also the employer community to help them deconstruct these ideas about what makes a work-ready student as soon as they graduate. So I think that, to your first question, students are work-ready, but given the dynamic change going on in the workforce and on our campuses and in society in general, that both sides need to do a little bit more work to come together to help their students be better prepared for the workforce.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And Lori, you've made a comment before about the philosophy student who doesn't see any philosopher job titles.
Right.
I mean, what kinds of things is Purdue doing within the College of Liberal Arts to sort of drive that awareness and that communication?
Well, I think there are a few things. One, and you know this because we've worked on it together, is trying to find more opportunities for students to think about career path. And so we have talked a lot with students about the idea of Parker Dewey's micro internships. For liberal arts students, part of what's difficult is that the horizon is so vast. At Purdue, they're going to school alongside STEM majors who have very linear looking career paths from the perspective of a 19 or 20-year-old. But helping a student who's majoring in any of the humanities or social sciences think about what that can mean and have the ability to test that through micro internships, to gain real world experience through internships, to get a taste of what the opportunity is. We know that 10 years out, 15 years out, they're gonna have great careers. I think it's really about how you start, how you can launch those in a better way for those students, and lean into the fact that they are going to be adaptable, that as a workforce changes rapidly, they will be well prepared to continue to learn and to position themselves for success as they move through their careers.
No, and it's interesting because, again, both of you talked about the fact that the college students have those, again, you use the term soft skills, which I prefer the term core skills, the problem solving, grit, communication, et cetera.
I'll do that one as well, moving forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We can call the victory. We can call the victory. But one of the things, Ed, I know Microsoft is doing a ton of is the 21st century skills. How do you help those students who have really, really, really strong core skills sort of develop those other skills that might be more technical should they want to pursue that? I mean, would love to hear some of the things you're seeing at Microsoft.
Yeah, so my team is the 21st Century Job Skills and Employability team. And our core is to grow the workforce in 4 key areas: data science, cybersecurity, AI, and computer science. And so in order for somebody to be successful in any of those roles, they do need the core skills or soft skills or transferable skills. I think soft skills is a term that's readily accepted, but nobody really likes it. And so what we're doing is some of the programs that we're developing that are in pilot right now is we're saying, yes, it's important to have those hard technical skills, which is what you would expect Microsoft to lead with. But we're also partnering with LinkedIn and LinkedIn Learning and bringing in courses around those soft or transferable or core skills, because it does make those, they're all critically important in order to make somebody successful and potentially more employable. And also, I think it's interesting, we talked about micro internships, what your firm does, Jeff, and I think that there's a term that we're using internally, my colleague, is gig turnships, which are these leveraging this push into the gig economy. And I think our legal doesn't like the term gig turnships for whatever reason. But I think that is really what it's about. It's being able to demonstrate that you actually have skills in a particular area. Maybe you don't have the pedigree, so what? I think honestly, and I think in leading up to this conversation, we had a very rich conversation on email about it's the full body of work. It's not, and it's the further removed you get from college, the less people actually look to the brand that you're carrying with you, and they look more at your experience. I mean, I would much rather employ someone that I know has the skills to do the job relative to where they went to school.
And it's again, the challenge is how do these students convey those skills, and how do we retrain hiring managers or companies to look beyond sort of just the GPA and academic pedigree. And we talked a little bit about big companies. Michelle, are things different at a smaller but still rapidly growing company like Sprout?
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing at Sprout Social is we've created a new job description that was created by Jennifer Kim, who was previously at Lever, because the job descriptions are broken. Who all in here has drafted a job description with 20 bullet points on it? Right, and that person that you are looking to hire
Doesn't
is a unicorn.
exist.
They don't exist. And so what we have realized is that we're repelling people who could be really great fits for our roles. So many of us have heard the stat that women apply for jobs when they're 100% qualified. Men typically, these are broad generalizations, folks, men typically apply for jobs when they're 60% qualified. So if you are drafting that job description with 20 bullet points, there are women who could be really qualified for the job that you might hire that are not going to apply in the first place. There's research from Textio that says women apply for jobs or are interested in jobs that have narrative form job descriptions, and men like bullet points. So our job description, this impact job description, forces our hiring managers to get really clear about what they need from this person, what are the key competencies that they need, and lay that out in the impact that they will have in 1, 3, 6, and 12 months. And by laying it out that way, by forcing the hiring manager to be really clear about what the necessary skills are and what the nice-to-have skills are, has allowed us to attract the candidate who is the right fit for the position, and it has allowed, and we're kind of early in this, so we don't have hard stats yet, but it has allowed us to be more inclusive in the people that we are hiring. So I'd encourage people to really be thoughtful about what are the key skills that you are needing, and do that work up front before you put your job description out. That's been really helpful for us.
And one of the things you mentioned on our call, though, was that as a smaller company, you don't necessarily have all of the resources of a Microsoft or a Pepsi to coach and train and mentor. Are there any best practices or things you're doing at Sprout beyond, again, updating the job descriptions, which is a huge win, but what other things are you doing that we could all learn from?
Yeah, we have to do a little bit more work because we're a small software company in the Midwest. So we can't compete with a Microsoft in those ways because we don't have all of those resources. So what it requires of us is to do more work to tell students about who we are, what it is that we care about. And so we've done an overhaul of our website to talk about our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We host students in our space multiple times a month so they know what it is that we do, so they don't hear that we're a company that does social media and they think, oh, I can only work here if I do marketing. They see our entire space. They know that we have an engineering department, a finance department. So we're doing some additional extra work to make sure that our brand is out there and so that we are connected with our community. That's something that's really important to us, is that the community and people in Chicago know that we exist, that they're a place that they can come work, that they're represented, and that they belong at our space.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, one of the things you talked about was, again, with a lot of the students, not only do they not know about Sprout Social, which everyone in Chicago does, but you have students who are first generation or come from underrepresented populations that don't know about McKinsey versus Goldman Sachs. They've heard the names of both and they don't realize what's the difference between consulting and investment banking. What things are you seeing being done on campus around that?
Well, one of the things that through our Career Pathways initiative, we're trying to help students understand what it takes to build their brand and connect it to other big brands that also can, because this whole idea of brand follows a student throughout their lives, really. Where they go to school is a brand that's on them until they retire. You know, we all have probably worked at some place where a resume comes across a desk and the student went to Harvard, and all of a sudden, oh, they went to Harvard. And so you take that degree more seriously in some instances. So their institutional brand makes a difference, as well as the brand that they build for themselves. So helping them to be mindful of that and build that brand, and help them to understand that you know, the work that they're doing in trying to connect with those larger brands, and like the McKinseys or the other brands that are substantial and significant and have value, but aren't the ones that everyone knows about, walking around the Booz Allen Hamiltons and what have you. We're trying to work with the institutions to introduce those brands to students in different ways so that they understand that simply because it's not one of the kind of blue chip brands that everyone knows about because they're all over TV, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a brand that has value that the students should be considering. We've seen instances where students have gotten opportunities from strong companies that are smaller, more regional, not well known, and students aren't as willing to pursue those opportunities simply because they're not aware of them. So we're trying to help students understand that regardless of the brand, the experience helps to build their brand and allows them to connect with those larger brands sometime later on in their lives. So trying to deconstruct that idea that as soon as they graduate from college, they've got to go work for Microsoft or Goldman Sachs or something along those lines, and helping them to understand that the experience is what matters and allows them to build a brand that becomes more attractive to the bigger brand companies.
Are you seeing anything at
Well, so the other thing that we see, I think, is role bias, right? Students there are lots of opportunities for our students in sales and business development roles. And there's a lot of perception from the students that that's not something they want to do. They want to find ways to have careers that are meaningful. They want to do good in the world. And we're working to try and help them understand that there are lots of ways to do that. There are lots of paths to be able to make an impact. And they aren't all in tiny not-for-profits, that there are other places that you can have a meaningful impact, that impact is measured in lots of different ways, whether it's social impact, whether it is being part of a company that sustains a small community because the business there matters so much. And so helping them understand that and understand that maybe they don't know as much as they think they know about what a job title really means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things we talked about with Patrick was you also have this opposite effect of preconceived notions based upon a consumer-facing brand. That students hear a name like Pepsi and they have sort of assumptions about what a role is going to be. I want a tech job. I don't want to work for a soda company necessarily. And what they don't realize is actually there might be a great marketing tech role or development role or other technical role at a company like Pepsi, because they're not aware of that. And it's that same kind of not just role bias, but also sort of the negative company bias.
Well, and in building a new career center in our College of Liberal Arts, part of what I have asked the staff to try and do is to make sure that when we're having a panel, there are some companies that students will know. That, oh look, they're going to be here, and there may be more meaningful roles, there may be more roles in other places, but we have to have the carrot to dangle to try and get them in the room, right or wrong.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, that's one of the things we're trying to do with CPI as well, is to educate students about, you referenced this idea that Pepsi, people see it as a soda company, but doesn't realize how much technology is behind everything that they do. And so helping students to understand, getting back to what you're talking about, Lori, the roles that are available to them within these various companies can be broad and diverse as well.
Every company is a tech company, whether
Yes.
they realize it or not. I mean,
Yes.
there's tech roles in all the way down to being a baker. You need to know technology in some regards. So I think
And
there's a
every
lot of work.
company needs a liberal arts major in some part of the organization. True.
Agreed.
I completely agree. And I mean, that actually is a good segue to the fact that, and again, people on the panel have heard me complain about this a lot, that we talk about the tight labor market, and everyone says there's not enough students who are out there for full-time roles, but meanwhile, we're sitting here with 40% of recent grads either under or unemployed. We have jobs and we have candidates, we have a matching problem, and one of the questions becomes, is there really a skills gap, or what's causing it? And again, Ed, given the work you're doing around the 21st century skills, what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of times, particularly in the technology field, someone depending on their upbringing, their socioeconomic status, might think that they could not get a job in technology, or they could not learn how to do that particular job. And I think that's a very huge misconception. And we've been talking to a couple companies, and I think in a call I've used the word assessments, and people don't like that word. But there are companies that are really, through a series of questions and things like that, you learn a lot about yourself. And in a lot of regards, you find out that, hey, I may not think that I could become a web developer, as an example, but I actually, through some of these assessments, and I'll use that word lightly, determine that actually not only have you displayed the skills to be successful in that, you actually might enjoy that. And I think there's room for those types of those types of assessments for students to understand a little bit more about themselves, discover things about themselves, that they have some sort of a preconceived notion that there's a blocker there, that there's no way they could go into that world. I mean, for example, I've worked with a guy at Microsoft who's been at Microsoft for 15 years, and he has a philosophy degree, right? Like, you know, he works in a technology company with a philosophy degree. I think a lot of people would think, oh, well, I think was what we were discussing earlier, well, I don't have a technology degree, Microsoft would never look at me. I don't have a technology degree, and I've worked at Microsoft for 9 years now. So anything that we can do to help people understand more about themselves, I think the better it'll be.
One of the things I'm thinking about is if we're honest, and something that we've been reflecting on at Sprout is that we haven't done a good job of coaching up our managers to bring on young professionals. Like there's not necessarily a skills gap. Part of it is that as tech companies who are scaling really quickly, we have promoted really great individual contributors into management positions without giving them the skills to be able to coach people to be effective. So when someone comes on board, we want them to be ready to perform right away versus saying, there's some potential here that we can develop. This is something that I can coach you on. And we don't think about, we want people to be ready to go as soon as possible versus saying, this is a skill that I can be really great at coaching and placing people on a team where they can be coached into a role to be better. I could not be doing the role that I'm doing if I didn't have a really phenomenal coach in my previous job who worked with me and gave me feedback every single day, and I was crying because I thought that I was going to get fired. But she was so intentional and deliberate in coaching me, and that's something that we're missing, is investing in our managers so they can be effective at developing people.
Tough love, right?
Tough love,
Yeah.
really.
It is. And one of the things Ed brought up, sort of the concept of assessment, and I want to stick on that for 1 minute, because it's, again, a hot button issue with me as we talked about on the phone. I mean, Michelle, are you using assessment at Sprout, especially given Ed's comment that the average hiring manager spends 15 to 30 seconds on the resume, or are you using it top of funnel?
Yes, we do some form of assessment for most of our applicants, and so you go through, you do your recruiter phone screen, and then there's some kind of job assignment that you're doing, and then for our technical folks, they do some kind of tech assignment. So there is an assessment part because we want to make sure that people have some of these I don't know if we're using hard skills, but some of the harder skills.
Hard skills you can use.
What'd you say?
Hard skills you can use.
Yes.
Just hard and core.
Hard and core. So we do some assessment around that to help differentiate some of the candidates.
And then what about Brian and Lori? I mean, are you using assessment more on the career exploration side, or are you seeing it used either at any of the CPI schools or within Purdue?
I think some of the CPI schools are using some of the early assessments. I mean, I think it's still early on to try to determine that. I'm not, even though my background is research, and I used to work for the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is the largest survey of college students in the world now, but I take issue personally, and this is not me representing UNCF. I take issue personally with companies using assessments. I think that they can be, especially in this day and age where people can apply. You guys probably get at Microsoft sometimes thousands of applications for a single job, because given the online application system, you can apply for a job from India, China, wherever. So I understand there has to be some kind of process to weed out and whittle down to a group that you can work with. But I think that sometimes these assessments take out the human element. And getting back to, we know that there's bias in our standardized testing. SAT, ACT, all those tests have had evidence of bias there. So I think that it would be natural that there's probably bias in these corporate assessments that are used to whittle down candidates and candidate pools. So my personal issue, I have a personal issue with the assessments, and I've seen it happen in a situation that's very close to me. But so that's my one take on that. I'll get off my soapbox now. But some of the CPI schools are using those a little bit.
But it's more formative or diagnostic as opposed to high stakes.
Yes.
And that was the nuance that I wanted to bring out, where again, I used to work at ETS, and we talked about using assessments for good, not evil, using it not to filter out people, but for more self-awareness. I mean, is that a valuable tool within Purdue?
I think, the university has started using Gallup Strengths Finders with students to help sort of think about direction as soon as they come to Purdue, looking at those kinds of things. For our students, I think it's probably more the proof point that comes through things like internships or projects that they've worked on. We talk with students about how to take a very applied data project in a capstone course and reflect that in their LinkedIn, reflect that in their resumes, be able to use some of those outputs that may be from a paid experience, they may be from a classroom experience, and be able to talk about them. But I think students also, they're trying so hard to figure out what employers want to hear, and trying to figure out what the right answers are, that sometimes they get lost in that rabbit hole of trying to find the right answer, and they don't find the authentic answer. So I had a great conversation with a student last week who's graduating senior in political science, and he was talking about how he wants to work in the government and wants to work in immigration. And as an aside, he said, oh yeah, and by the way, on Tuesday, I'm going up to Chicago with my dad because he's gonna become a citizen. And I said, okay, that's the first line of your story when you have an interview. Start there and everyone will remember you. And he said, oh, I never would have thought that's what they'd want to hear. So students are struggling so hard to figure out what somebody wants to hear that they lose sight of what they ought to say.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful story, and we hear that a lot. One other thing, and again, this goes back to both Brian and Michelle's point about filtering out or weeding out candidates. Do you feel like that's still happening based upon what school? Like at Sprout, are you only going to certain schools, or at Microsoft? And what's the impact of that?
No, we're no longer going to only certain schools because that is just, then we're not getting the full breadth of talent that we possibly can have. So what we are doing is looking at the resume, doing the recruitment screen, we're doing the assessment, but it is part of a broader package. Like, we have a really structured and thoughtful interview process so it is equitable, so that people are moving through at the same, regardless of your background, regardless of your identity, that you're moving through at the same rate. And that assessment is part of a broader package because, to your point, you have to look at people as humans, and so there's multiple steps of our interview process, so we're looking at the candidate as a really holistic person.
Can I just clarify, when I say assessment, I mean for good. This
Yes.
is more.
No, I know.
This isn't Microsoft screening, and they may do that in some parts of the company. I'm more like, we want more people. I want to grow the workforce in those 4 key areas, and so through tools, you can help expose people to those things that they may not have known about.
And I'm really, really happy that we've clarified that, because again, when people think about assessment, they often think about SAT, ACT, how do we filter people out?
I hate the SAT.
Me too. But now we know we can all buy our way in. Sorry, was that too soon? Any USC people here? Sorry.
I want to add to something that Michelle was talking about, this idea of, and the question that you asked about recruiting, where we recruit. We get companies that come to us on a regular basis asking us, help us diversify our pool of employees or potential employees. Lots of companies, we do internship programs with 30 some odd companies where we help prepare students, a more diverse pool of students into their companies. But the problem is that I think, and one of the first questions we usually ask them is, where are you recruiting now? And they will typically say either the Ivies or the big research universities. Sorry, Purdue, I went to IU. Those are the places that they recruit. And even there's bias within the HBCU community in that when they recruited HBCUs, they only recruited 4 or 5 of them: Spelman, Morehouse, Howard, Hampton, Xavier. And as an example, for instance, so UNCF does this thing called the HBCU ICE Innovation Collaboration. I can't remember what the E stands for, but it's out of Silicon Valley every fall. And we do a hackathon and with students from HBCUs. And there are students from places like Jarvis Christian College. Anyone ever heard of Jarvis Christian College? Little HBCU in Texas. Yes, we got a couple people. Little HBCU in Texas, who normally those campuses, those employers in Silicon Valley would never go to Jarvis Christian and recruit. But because we were able to bring the students there, some students were able to prove themselves. Now one is doing an internship that has already been offered a job. That we've heard that that's been a great find for them. we need to get more of those kinds of experiences and exposure to understand that talent exists everywhere, and that we have to turn over every rock that we can, especially given the competitiveness of the work world in which we're living, that we can't continue to focus on just a select set of 30 to 50 institutions because we think that's where the smartest students go. But there are a couple of thousand other institutions that are great pools of strong talent that can help our institutions, our companies thrive as well.
And what's neat about that, and again, Ed would love your take on this, what's neat about that is not only does it help a company for driving diversity and inclusion, but does it also help a company, or it seems like it would also help a company find talent in a less competitive way? Again, back to your point, Brian, that way you're not competing at Caltech or Berkeley for the same handful of people. I mean, are your hiring managers or HR departments seeing that sort of?
There's inside of Microsoft, and I'm not in the HR capability, but I've heard of the idea of changing the job description and not requiring a degree. So you're really focused on skills-based. It's a skills-based hiring approach. And I think motions like that will definitely, can definitely increase, the type of candidate pool, because I think you in some job descriptions now, you see needs for you from a top tier university. How much bias are you inserting into the system?
Entry level
with that,
job,
right?
4 years experience required.
Exactly, exactly. So I think as maybe a takeaway for some of the thought leaders in this room, could we move to a fully skills-based hiring approach? Eliminating the requirement for a degree, and let alone a degree from a top brand.
Connected to working with universities, something that we're doing at Sprout is thinking about how we can partner more closely with educators in the city. I mean, we're in Chicago. There are so many high schoolers or programs that we can be partnering with. And so the students that I said we are hosting, they are freshmen through seniors in high school, and we bring them into our space to tell them about our company and what the opportunities are available. So being really thoughtful about the partnerships that you have, even before you're working with colleges, how do we influence the pipeline a little bit earlier so that those students know what's available to them, which has been transformative. We now have high school students who are reaching out to our employees, and we're having employees come in and talk about their experiences. We're having them share what they love about Sprout, where they went to school, and so it's influencing the way that students are even thinking about what they want to major in, what they want to be exposed to, and they're partnering more closely with our employees. But also that brings us closer to this idea of proximity. We make change when we are proximate to people who are different from us, and so that's what we really deeply believe at Sprout is when we have our employees who are working with young students of color from the South and the West Side, then they are no longer scared of that young black man who's walking down the street, because they were able to talk to them and hear about their background, their experience, what they care about, their family, that they're using their first paycheck to help their family. When you get to hear that as an employee, it changes your mind about how you want to make impact in the city and who you can then hire when those students finally graduate from college, because you remember that high school student that you worked with before.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And since we weren't able to beat up on Ed over assessment, I do want to ask Lori, what are your thoughts about sort of the move towards getting rid of the college degree, or companies saying, yeah, you don't need a college degree?
I think it's an interesting short-term idea, but I'm not sure how it works in the long term. So there are lots of places in the world that are still very credential-oriented and that are still going to have barriers. So what happens in 10 years or what happens in 15 years? Have the students learned a single skill, but if the workplace completely changes and that skill isn't going to advance their career anymore, then what? What is the reskilling or upskilling that they're going to have to go back and get at that point in time? And I worry too, when we talk about the liberal arts and questions of ROI on the liberal arts, do we run the risk of stratifying even more and having the liberal arts, which is where the majority of Fortune 500 CEOs in this company come from educationally, be from only a tiny group of institutions and a tiny group of families who can afford to be less concerned about ROI? And what does that mean? Do we end up really creating even more of a class distinction based on educational opportunity?
And I second Lori's emotion, not that I'm and Ed made it clear he doesn't work in HR. But yes, I'm troubled by the narrative around whether or not a college degree is worth it that is permeating the media a little bit. And so I wouldn't want to go down that pathway. And the reason I'm troubled by that is because the students and people and individuals who need a college degree the most, who benefit from a college degree the most, are the ones who need the college degree.
It's not the Mark Zuckerbergs
No,
or Bill
no.
Gates coming from affluent families.
Exactly.
It's first generation where it's those core skills.
Yes, and the people who always say that, who are perpetuating this narrative that a college degree isn't necessarily worth it, or that micro-credentials, such as just go to a coding boot camp, for instance, that's all you need. Those people are still sending their kids to college.
Yeah. And by the way,
And
just
they went to Thomas Jefferson High School in Northern Virginia,
Yes, that's
one
right.
of the best high schools in the country, and
Yes.
they're coming from a totally different
Yes.
position.
And by the way, just to be clear, to defend Ed, not that he needs our
Yes.
help, the 21st Century Skills program that he leads is partnering with colleges to very much complement what they're doing.
Absolutely.
So
With
he was
Purdue,
simply, I'll say that again?
With Purdue.
With Purdue, it's simply opining on an overall trend. So I just wanted to make sure you
I
didn't
think
think
my
we were
point
ganging up on
is,
you.
I think if you eliminate, I'm not saying that there isn't value in a college degree. I'm saying that if you were to remove that as a requirement, I think you would increase the diversity of the candidate pool, and you would remove this bias that is inherent with these top brands. Like if you're not carrying that top brand with you, some of the smaller schools that you mentioned, there's great talent there. If you remove that, so I think if people see that, they're like, they're never going to look at me. I'm not even going to bother applying.
And I wonder, in deconstructing the whole brand idea, because that's really what this is all about. Some schools have stronger brands than others.
Yep.
And I think that's where I would amend your recommendation is, how do we help to deconstruct our employers and our society writ large, essentially, of this idea that certain brands are far and above and away better than others?
It goes back to my choppy intro, that the flip side of brand is stereotype. It's assumptions that we make based upon the brands of companies or the brands of students. Michelle, it looked like you were trying to get a word in.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about the college degree. I think it's such a privilege for us to be able to sit here and say that you have to have a college degree, that it's really important. It's not that it's not, but when I think about, for example, our engineering department, the women that we've been able to hire and the people of color that we've been able to hire who come in with a starting salary of $70,000 to $80,000, those are underrepresented people who would not be able to work at our company, who wouldn't be able to provide for their families and create a new pathway and set a different example if we said we need a college degree. So college degree is really important, but I think it's such a privilege to be able to say that everyone has that kind of access, because we all know being here that you don't. The people whose lives will be transformed when we strip away this need to have a college degree are underrepresented people who have been overlooked.
How did they get skilled? How did they?
Through a boot camp.
Through boot camp.
Yeah.
Yep.
I wish we had 45 more minutes, because that is really interesting, and it'd be interesting to see what happens to them 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and if there's an opportunity to take sort of the reverse of what the 21st Century Skills team is doing and say, can we take a liberal arts program and upskill those core skills for people who are already in the workforce? But since we only have about 2 minutes left, I would love each panelist to just share one recommendation that you think the audience can take back and is actionable. And Michelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, the one thing that I would encourage everyone to think, we're talking about, or people often talk about diversity and inclusion, and the thing that we really focus on and prioritize at Sprout is equity, and we define equity as systems level change, getting at the root of the problem, because diversity and inclusion are symptoms of having broken systems. And so we try to think about, why aren't we getting underrepresented people applying to our jobs? That's why we have a new job description. That's why we have mentorship programs. That's why we have education to help people understand what diversity, equity, inclusion, systems of oppression are at work in our workplace. So think about equity at whatever your institution is, whatever your organization.
Ed.
I would say assessments for good, really. I think not as a screening mechanism to get the right candidate pool. I think I encourage people, assessments for good, to help the younger generation understand and discover things about themselves is really can help us with the skill shortage that we're experiencing right now.
Brian.
Most people in here are on campus, right?
It's a mix.
It's a mix? Okay. So for those in the employer community, I would encourage you to encourage the recruiters in your company to think about broadening where they recruit students from for the employer pool. For those on campus, I would say to help students be mindful about how they promote their own individual brand. Structure opportunities and experiences within the the undergraduate curriculum that help students to be best prepared to communicate strongly who they are and the skill set that they bring to a potential employer.
Lori.
So everybody has a need to take an applicant pool of 1,000 students or 1,000 applicants and make it manageable. But be really mindful about the ways in which you make that number manageable. When you narrow it by things like grade point average, you aren't taking into account the ways in which a student struggled and found a new major where they're finding greater success, and it's a big hole to dig out of. That they may be first generation students, have family obligations, they're working at the same time. It doesn't measure grit. It doesn't measure everything that you need. And so be mindful of one-dimensional weed outs that will result in one-dimensional hires.
Thank you so much for joining us for these 45 minutes, and hopefully we all learned a little something. I know I did. Thank you to the great panel for being here with us.
Thank you.